pro-life causes, and a demographer a little later in the show. We should be sure to like the Western Standards page on Facebook to be notified when we go live, and to subscribe to our website to support our content. Bringing Mr. Ross onto our show today made me reflect about my own heritage. While I am a status First Nations person, born of an unwed mother, through my adoption, I became a son of privilege. I was raised away from the reality many Aboriginals face on and off reserve. My perspective is different from most other agitators amongst Indigenous peoples on a range of issues. For my difference of opinion, I have been called a red apple, someone who has internalized their oppression, and far worse pejoratives over the years. In short, because I did not suffer the way many of my brothers and sisters did, I'm not a real Indian. That's an accusation I've struggled with in my life for several years. What does my heritage really mean? I'm not sure. My adoptive parents couldn't have children. A series of miracles literally occurred to place me in their hands at birth. My parents, like myself, are people of deep faith. And throughout my life, my father, who's a bit of a mystic, always reminded me of the story of Moses, given that I'd been adopted away from my people. A rather big calling if one remembers the Bible stories in the various Hollywood versions. But more importantly, the idea that we, the First Peoples of Canada, might need to make a way for ourselves to leave institutional slavery behind and create a better future for our children, apart from the victimhood propagated by some organizers or the Supreme Court challenge industry, is something I believe every status, non-status, Inuit, or Métis person can get behind. What might that Canada look like? In my first column for the Western Standard, I stated that Western sovereignty, or a better deal from Ottawa, whichever, could not be achieved without Aboriginal support. In so many words, as we talk about redrawing Canada's boundaries, perhaps we need to start at home with what we mean by saying on or off reserve, as well as traditional territory. We, First Peoples of Canada, are governed by an entirely different set of laws that give both communal as well as individual rights. Housing, taxation, starting a business, even local festivals will all, in some way or other, fall under agreements with various governments at various levels. If somehow those rights could be spread to include non-Indigenous, or a social contract could be made, the West would transform. If nothing else, those of us who live west of Lakehead need to learn to cooperate and to forgive each other our trespasses. The divide and conquer strategy from Ottawa has been on full display for over a century when it comes to the classes of Indigenous persons, as well as non-Indigenous versus Indigenous over the fight of resources. The arrangement is sickening, and Ottawa should stop it. We have a choice about how to proceed. I have a choice about how to reconcile the two solitudes within my own heritage. Perhaps if I live that out as best I can and ask my neighbors to do the same, we'll have a brighter future for all of our families. I certainly believe such a path is worth a try. Bringing on Ellis Ross right away. Welcome to the program, Ellis.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think that one of the key things that we're trying to do here at the Western Standard is talk about development and talk about what development means in Canada. Obviously, when it comes to British Columbia, you've been at the forefront of this question for a long time. And I think that just as we spoke in a previous interview, I would like to just discuss a little bit, how did you come to the place you've come to as a First Nations person? And how do you bridge the gap between what seems to be a lot of anti-development rhetoric on a certain side of the spectrum and the need for us to move forward as a people, as a nation?
Well, to be honest, in the beginning, I actually opposed economic development, resource development. I opposed everything, even though I actually worked most of my life in it, because I had never seen or actually delved into the social issues that comes with not having an economy. And every reserve across Canada will tell you they have no economy. Therefore, they're young people, they're old people, they have nothing to do. And so all they're left with is basically all the social ills that come with living on reserve. A lot of what you see in Canada right now is 50% of Aboriginals live off reserve is for that reason. They're looking for something. And they're looking just to build their own life. That's all they're doing. There's not many Aboriginals out there that are out there protesting every day and, denouncing colonialism or the settlers. The Aboriginals are just like everybody else. They just want to build a life, have a family, have a future. And then when I realized this, I started to dig more into what an economy meant, how to build an economy, and more importantly, how a strong economy actually builds a society. And that's why I do what I do.
In a previous conversation that you and I had, you mentioned that it was actually in looking for funding for your girls' basketball team, I believe, that you realized that something had to change inside of the First Nation community you were in. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I got nominated to be in council in 2003, and like everybody else that gets nominated, I felt I didn't belong there, but I kept my name in because I was coach of a basketball team, a number of them, and fundraising was always the toughest thing on reserve because nobody has any money, and we had to raise at least $5,000 to $7,000 every year just to get to our tournaments, and that was a struggle. So I figured I'd leave my name in for nomination for council because I could tap into the council's vast resources and their huge bank account. But when I got into council, it took me about a month or two to realize council had no money. They had nothing. They were actually in so much debt. Canada, under the Indian Act, was going to come in and shut council down, and Canada was going to start paying the debts for us. So that was quite the rude awakening for me because I believed all the rhetoric, right? About how all the territory and the wealth and the future. I used to listen to politicians' speeches talking about new relationships, and I just got totally disgusted by these speeches after a while when I figured out the truth about where we were.
We in the middle of well, actually, right before the pandemic began last year. Obviously, there was the wet sweat protests, and there had already been agreements about Coastal GasLink and the pipeline. How does that get negotiated? Something I talked about with one of my guests not just a few days ago is that people talk about Western sovereignty and all sorts of other things, but they don't realize, I think, in the rest of the West, in Alberta and the prairies, that BC can have these kind of microcosms of conflict. How do we find solidarity inside of the Aboriginal population in BC, or how does everybody get brought to the table to help BC be a better place?
I doubt you can achieve that. I mean, you can do it in pockets, like what we did with the Chevron LNG project. We also did it again loosely for the LNG Canada project. But the thing that you can bring a group of First Nations together in solidarity is I've tried. It's not possible. But you do have that one goal for all First Nations individually, where they want jobs for their people, they want revenues for their own programs. That was the key for us in terms of uniting First Nations from Prince George to Kitimat. But I was fortunate when I was a councillor. My chief councillor was actually the one who proposed this the first place on a business case, and he told all the other First Nations. He said, "You know what? Leave your politics and your lawyers by the door. We'll call the lawyers in once we have the agreement in principle and they can figure out the details. But we're not going to let the lawyers negotiate these agreements for us." That was actually the first step in terms of getting these LNG projects across the finish line here in BC.
I think that's exactly something that needs to be talked about as well throughout our time together here, just kind of outlining some issues. We'll visit them again, obviously, before the hour is up. But this is something else that I really appreciate about our original conversation that happened just a little while ago. Is I'm trying to remember what the exact phrase you used on that regard, but I always call it the Supreme Court industrial complex. There's this challenge system, like this idea that somehow the only reason that lawyers are even talking to the First Nations is that they're going to bring them to the Supreme Court, and that's how they're going to retire. How do we change that culture, or do First Nations know that they're getting used that way?
Well, it's an education process, and it's a leadership style. It's something that I learned along the way from my previous leaders, and ultimately, when I talk about leadership has got to understand exactly what you want to achieve. If you want to achieve something, then you've got to get rid of some of the stuff that doesn't actually get you there. By the time I became chief counselor, all I had to do really was put some more depth into our strategies. I added more the components to it, but it was mainly driven by the leadership, and it was actually a turning point for us because what I found when I went around BC, when I was talking about LNG, I was talking about forestry, I was talking about how to engage in the economy. what I found was a lot of leadership in the First Nation community had the mentality of all or nothing, and it's a defeatist attitude. And at the end of the day, if you have this all or nothing attitude, well, 10% of nothing is nothing. What did you really achieve? And so I actually learned this from a businessman of all people when I was talking about my frustration about not getting some agreements signed, and it actually changed my perspective on what I should be negotiating for, because at times I was the all or nothing negotiator as well.
I think that that's maybe even a good place to start, is to talk about like how did you learn this, the style that you've taken. I really appreciate your style, both in the legislature and in public and in your statements. I know at times you told me last time that there are certain your temper can get the better of you at times, but I think that just as a starting place, like I think the thing that really gets to me about your leadership campaign, the fact that you've submitted that you've put your name forward, is that like you're a real British Columbian. Like you started with your own two hands and you worked through the system and got to be an elected person, but you have not forgotten the people you came from. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your background, Ellis?
Yeah, I'm born and raised on reserve, regardless of the pale color I have. But I was a laborer most of my life, all my life actually. But anything I get my hands on. Uh, I worked for DFO for a few years. I ran a business with my brothers for a few years. It was actually my father, when I became a young man, that did not want me to be a fisherman, a commercial fisherman, which used to be typical of First Nations to get into that profession. Did not want me that, and he actually encouraged me to go off reserve, because back in those days, if you wanted a job on reserve, you had to go to council. That was the only employer in town. But he actually encouraged me to go off reserve and look for jobs. And so most of my life I spent working off reserve, and I had a perspective of what it meant to be out there in the private sector. And so that was just my life. My dad actually encouraged me to do everything I could, sports, jobs, just go out and get new experiences. And so, that lifetime of experience is actually what got me here.
Eventually, of course, you ended up the chief counselor of the Haisla First Nation. What kind of was that experience like? Did you find that you had to change culture around you, or did you have to learn from the culture there and then kind of move forward the best way you could? Is the First Nation that you're a part of, was it different than its neighbors in its attitude or in its openness maybe to new ideas, and that's why it's been more successful than some of its neighbors?
Well, before I became chief, I was actually a paid counselor for 8 years. So I had plenty of time to learn and read, and so by the time I became chief counselor, I had a pretty good idea of where I wanted to take our people. And the bottom line was, my message was, guys, if we want the better future we always talk about, we have to change. We have to change our attitude, our mentality. We have to change our structure. Uh, and it took me a while, to convince my council. In fact, the first 2 years of my chief counselor, my council actually disapproved of some of my initiatives, including the structure. But the following 2 years, we got a brand new council, and they were open to change and open to talking. So that being done, I went down to my community in all the different off reserve areas as well, and told them about the change that I was proposing. And ultimately, I was asking them, "You got to trust me. I'm going to do some things that have never been done before. I'm going to do it on a grand scale. But if you trust me, our future will be solid." And then that's why the Haisla are so successful today. We went from being one of the poorest bands back in 2003 to probably one of the most wealthiest, most progressive. I mean, we don't go out looking for government money now to build our public works building, for instance. We don't go out looking for money to repair our soccer field. Our council just sits down and sets out a budget, and they pay for it themselves. I mean, they're still continuing. And by the way, the money's still coming in. And this is the truest form of independence I can think of. Self-governance, I've never was a fan of self-governance, but independence, yes, I was always a fan. But it took a while. Uh, so by the time I resigned as chief counselor, there was a lot of a lot of emotion from my people, as well as my family and myself, because we had progressed so much in 6 years. It was just amazing. But it took a lot of hard work to change the attitudes. I mean, there's always a 10% of people that will oppose everything you do, no matter what, and they're still there today. But the majority of our people, they're not looking back, and they're talking about new things nowadays. They're not talking about the welfare list or unemployment or the cupboard is bare. They're not talking about that. They're talking about different things, mainly a brighter future.
What blows me away isn't just that. Of course, that's achievable, and I always believed that it was achievable for any person in Canada. I really believe that, but that there's anybody who would try to hold that back. I'm referring, of course, to some of your discussions with people on the other side, on the opposite side. People agitate against this kind of progress, or think that only maybe a victim mentality should be used, or that we should always use the court system, or find it always through government, not through private means. Thinking most specifically probably of your interaction with Pam Palmetto on CTV, I think it was. And I really appreciated what you were saying. I'm sure that maybe some other people didn't, but why don't you tell us a little bit about those conflicts where you're trying to convince other people this is the way forward, but they just want to be stuck in the old way?
Well, what I learned was learned on the job. And what I learned was being a typical Aboriginal that didn't have a future. And when I got into leadership position, when I found out that there's a lot of Aboriginals across Canada that are facing the same thing, that got me very angry. But it also got me very focused in terms of, and this is why I said a few years ago, I don't think BC is ready for my kind of leadership, because I get an idea in my head. It's backed up by principles. It's backed up by knowledge. It's backed up by history, and then I go after it. And the only thing that really offends me in terms of talking to the opposition about this is when somebody that hasn't lived the same life I have, has not had the same learning experiences, and starts talking in a condescending tone, or starts being disrespectful, or starts to basically disregard, your history and your knowledge base, and just comes up with a high level academic argument that's not even, proven in the real world. That's what really offends me. Uh, but any other kind of conversation, I don't mind. I've never come across any really offensive debates in my lifetime. I mean, a lot of debates you find are steeped in ignorance, for example, which is fine.
Yeah.
If you find some debates that are steeped in deeply held beliefs, that's fine. But don't disrespect the other side. Especially if the other side is actually has a lived experience. And so I've got the way I thought about it back then, and I still think about it today. I've got a very short window to provide a tremendous amount of change. Very short window, and I'm not just talking about a politician's life. I'm talking about the lifetime of a person. So I don't have time to waste on these nonsensical debates. I don't have time to argue the nuances of why I think the way I think in terms of society or an economy. I believe I have a job to do, and I want to do it as quickly and efficiently as I can.
One of the things that comes to mind about all of this economic development that's happening here in the north, I know that you've spoken about before, is the idea that there could be a plastics plant coming off of one of the pipelines, and that we can be producing serious industrial plastics here in British Columbia. So a domestic manufacturing. Is this the way forward for First Nations in general, and specifically to this project? What are the pieces that still have to be put together there for this to become a reality?
Well, the idea came from the Prince George area, and initially it was in connection with the First Nation. But my point was really manufacturing, if this is what the people want, is the way to go for British Columbians in general. And I've heard about this manufacturing idea. We got to get back to manufacturing. We got to stop sending our resources, in its raw form to Asia. We add value to that product before we send it out. I've heard this for years. And it's really easy for a politician to get up and say this and get a few votes. It's another thing to actually do it.
Mhm.
And so when I found this person that was proposing is out of Prince George, and I found similar projects proposed around BC. The only thing that I could see was, okay, there's no political will behind it, and there's no government support behind it. There's no incentives. So all this talk about we should get back into manufacturing, that's all hot air. That's nothing. So what I've been trying to do is based on my experience now in terms of reviewing projects, and now I have experience in terms of reviewing legislation. I think this is possible. I think it is really truly possible, and it's something I've never heard of before in terms of making plastics out of an LNG pipeline. And the guy that's doing this is taking an incredible amount of risk. He's putting in a tremendous amount of time and effort, and all he needs really is support. That's all he needs. Like he's got a land base, and for those that talk about, well, that's just a dream. It's never going to work. And well, you know what? Back in 2004, LNG was a dream. It was a dream. Nobody believed in it. My band stuck with it from 2004 to today's date. And guess what? LNG Canada is probably halfway through building their export facility in Kitimat. I mean, there's ways to take a dream to a vision and reality. And, it's, I see that. I understand that. And what we've done in Kitimat is we've taken that dream to reality on a few different occasions. And we're thinking, okay, what's next? And I think this is what BC's got to consider. You have so much potential, and you talk about that potential, but you don't have that crucial next step of converting that dream into reality. You don't have that, whether it be politics or whether it be your laws or your policies or regulations. For some reason, you can't make that next step. You've done it in certain occasions with certain products, like say pellets, which is a great story in BC. But if you really truly want to come out of a COVID crisis in terms of the economy, or you really want to see the West, build up, in terms of strength in their own right, then you got to stop talking and you got to start doing. And this is what I learned over my years in my territory, that doing has tremendous awards for the region and the province and the country.
I think that's precisely it. A lot of promises have been made over the years about all sorts of issues, particularly, as you mentioned, the value added question. I think something else that, at least for all of our listeners over the Rockies and on this side of the Rockies, that's always a bit of a constant question is the question of regulation. We have various boards and committees at the federal and provincial level that are supposed to try and help us understand whether or not a project is viable or if it's going to be environmentally safe, et cetera. What's been your experience with some of that as a member of government? Do you think that the best interests are being served there, or is there people just trying to put locks up and walls up to keep things from getting done? What do you think?
I think it's a mix. It's a mix of politics, ideology, outdated regulations, and I don't think BC has really caught up to the idea that the world is leaving us behind. The world will take our resources happily, and then they'll convert it into some value-added product, and they'll make a ton of money. And BC has always complained about this, but we haven't caught up to the idea on how to fix it. And the way to fix it it might be painful in the beginning, but if you establish some kind of base for value-added industries here, then maybe 5, 10, 15 years, that pain has gone away, and this just becomes part of your economic fabric, part of your social fabric. I mean, but you got to make a move sometime. You got to stop talking. You got to stop doing it. In fact, I'll give you an example here in BC. We talk about clean energy,
Hmm.
but we canceled the standing offer program for clean energy projects in BC. Canceled it. This government actually proposed buying energy off the grid, mainly from the United States, who still uses coal for power. We got the geothermal process. In terms of getting a process, is not clear. It's not defined. So you can go out and get a permit, say, to do exploration of oil and gas drilling. You can get that quite easily because the process is defined. The process to go after an exploratory permit for geothermal drilling is not clear. Even a First Nation in BC can't get through that process. In fact, if the minister, it doesn't feel good about approving or disapproving that project, they won't make that approval. I mean, this is all that talk about clean energy and cutting your emissions, and here you have an opportunity to actually develop a geothermal industry in BC, but your regulations are so outdated and so vague, and they're not designed with the idea of getting that permit off quickly. It just, I don't know. In some cases, I think it just boggles my mind in terms of the politics versus the actuality of doing something is just not matching up.
During your time in government, have you had any ability to influence that, or to try and at least bring the current ruling party now to account and try and ask them, hey, let's move forward on this. This isn't a political issue. This is a BC issue, bringing British Columbians together.
Well, the legislatures, the way they work is they don't work like that, out in the open. Like you see us in the legislature, and you'll see the leaders talk about, well, let's work together in the legislature. Well, it doesn't work like that. And any opposition member will tell you, they put a private member's bill on the floor for debate, and the government actually decides which bills that they'll debate and which ones they'll see through. Well, governments never bring up private member bills from the opposition. I mean, even when we're debating a bill that's put forward by the government, the opposition will put in some amendments to that bill during the debate. Well, government doesn't entertain the idea of an amendment coming from opposition unless that opposition is actually keeping you in power, like what happened here in BC. The Green Party, put their votes toward the NDP, therefore they took government away from the BC Liberals. Well, the government will entertain their amendments. They'll entertain their private members' bills because they're supporting them to keep them in their leadership position. But what I've done, and this was actually suggested to me before, that I work on issues in my riding with the ministers in question. And so the ministers I've talked to over the years, I've said, look, I'm not looking to embarrass you. I've got this issue in my riding. All I really need is some kind of help to get this issue resolved. And if we can work it together, or even if you can resolve on your own, I'm good. I'm happy. I won't go running to the newspaper. You can take credit. That doesn't bother me. So that's really the kind of cooperation that I look for. I don't know if that happens often, but that's what I found quite effective.
With British Columbia and even kind of its sister, Alberta, and then of course the rest of the West. This has always been a point of contention too, is that somehow, Alberta has all these resources and they need to get them to tidewater, and there's been opposition in BC from both governments at this point. That happened under Christy Clark as well, or at least trying to negotiate very strongly. And now under the NDP, we're still building the pipeline, but we are not building Northern Gateway. That has not been resurrected. What needs to change with that? Do the legislators in British Columbia need to, I don't know, have a retreat with their brothers and sisters in Edmonton and learn how to communicate better, or is it a leadership question?
I come from reserve. And I refer to coming from reserve as basically coming from a different country. So when I come into this situation, this arena, I was quite surprised at the relationships that provinces have with each other. I mean, it's almost oppositional. You have trade barriers. There's no cooperation. In fact, we'll cooperate at the drop of a hat with the United States first, or the European Union first, before we go out and cooperate with our neighbors, Alberta or Yukon or Saskatchewan. It's quite mind-boggling to me. Yeah. In fact, the other thing I've noticed too is that I don't really sense any high level of pride in being a Canadian. I mean, I'm proud of being an Aboriginal. I'm proud of being a Haisla. You know, it was something I took to the table and said, no, I'm doing this for the greater good of where I come from, for the people I represent. And so as MLA, I just took the same approach. I'm going to fight for what's important to Skeena. But I don't see this pride. Like you go to the United States and you see there's tremendous amount of pride. You talk to immigrants that came to Canada, even if they're second generation or third generation, they're really proud of where they came from. But try find a proud Canadian. No, try find them, and they're hard to come by. And what I don't understand about is why that pride is not there. Why are people so afraid to be proud of BC or proud of Canada? Because this is really a great place to live. We got good services, we got good highways, we got good medical, regardless of the rhetoric out there. You know, we got great freedoms, right? And this should be the land of opportunity. If you want to work hard, if you want to sacrifice, you know, you can achieve this. So why are we not proud of this? Why are we always beating up on ourselves and believing the rhetoric out there that talks about how Canada is actually, you know, we're bad, whether we're talking about our politics or somewhere we're talking about our environmental standards or our ideas on how to build up our economy, which in turn helps us build up a society. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And it's kind of like somebody that came in from the outside and came in here. I'm still surprised to this day, and I want to tell Canadians that there's no reason not to be proud. I'm not saying going out there and, you know, wave the flag and do all that kind of stuff, but be proud, because this is a great place to come from. This is a great place to live.
I think that's exactly where we have to take off from when it comes to even what we have to do inside of our provinces or inside of our communities. When we had spoken before, something that you made clear to me was that you weren't interested in the divisions that are even within your party or within BC in general. You were interested in appealing to all British Columbians with a BC-centric policy, a way for all of us to figure out how to deal with housing and everything else. What do you think is missing there when it comes to politics of BC? There's a lot of politics of division even in our province. How do you move forward with that?
Well, it's going to be hard because you got so many different levels of division, right? You got the political parties, you got the ideologies, you got the different communities that have different interests and different goals. It's going to be really hard. But it's, you know, if there's ever a time to talk about coming together, now's the time. Because coming out of the COVID, you know, there's two things I think that have to happen. We have to rebuild our economy and we have to rebuild our society. I mean, the effects that COVID restrictions have had in our society is heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, it's and by the way, we can't be naive to think that our competitors, our neighbors all over the world are going to be thinking the same thing. They're going to be thinking about how do we get our economy back? What can we do in terms of incentives? How can we take business away from, you know, Joe Blow in Canada and bring it to our region? So we can't be naive in thinking this. I mean, BC, Canada, if you really want to reestablish your economy and therefore reset your society, not reset, sorry about that, but actually rebuild your society, you got to think about some really aggressive approaches to rebuilding your economy. And yeah, talk about the drawbacks, talk about the negatives, talk about the positives. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is the well-being of Canadians. I don't want to see Canadians, you know, leave Canada for a job. I don't want to see us line up for welfare. I don't want to see that. I want to see people, you know, build a life. I want to see them get a mortgage, build a house, build a future, build a family. And for that, I think we really got to take a good, long, sobering look, you know, at how do we come out of this, given all the competition that we'll be up against.
You mentioned before that it wasn't sexy enough. The headline wasn't sexy enough. You know, young Aboriginal person gets their own job, buys their own house. It just wasn't sexy enough. It made more sense to talk about all the protests and everything else. How do we change the narrative?
Well, that's a tough one. I think it comes down to leadership. The ideas that I brought to my community in terms of how we get there even faster, they weren't well received. But it was a commitment to say, look, you're going to get a job. You're going to be able to build your own future. You won't have to rely on council. You won't have to rely on government. And then your kids will see that, and then they'll do the same. They'll follow in your footsteps. But in terms of trying to change the mentality of all BCers or Canadians, it's going to be really tough. But I think what's really going to have to happen if Canadians, and I hope this day doesn't come, Canadians are going to have to feel some pain before they realize, that their leadership selections actually mean something. And I've tried to point this out a number of times in terms of learning just by watching and reading what other regions have done. What happened in Venezuela is absolutely unbelievable. What happened to Greece? What happened to Detroit? Countries and cities going bankrupt, declaring bankruptcy, and having no economy. Venezuela is now printing out their money like $1 million notes. And some of their people are starting to go out in the streets, and they're starting to make basically origami out of their money because it's worthless. This is scary. This is scary. And this is what happens when all you do is elect politicians instead of electing somebody that takes a really keen interest in governance. There's a difference. You keep electing the politician, all he wants is your vote. That's all that politician wants. They're not concerned about balancing the budget. They're not concerned about building up the economy, right? They just want that vote. And so I think Venezuela, I think they had some leadership problems. I think places like you just have to Google how many cities in the United States went bankrupt, that declared bankruptcy. And all those workers then have their pensions wiped out, and then, because there's no economy, there's no jobs, you get basically the criminal element moves in because there's nothing there. And this is, I could relate because, like I said, every reserve across Canada has got no economy. There's nothing to do. And when you have no economy, you start to see other problems pop up. So I just think that Canadians wake up. You've got tremendous resources. You got tremendous potential. But if you don't elect people that favor governance over politics, then your future for your kids could be pretty murky.
No, absolutely. We're in the middle of the BC leadership race. You are the first contender who announced, and of course, that's happening as we speak. What are you finding as you speak to people about what happened with the last election, why the minority government happened, what changed people's attitude? Why did the BC Liberals lose power after being in power, what seemed to be indefeatable for several years?
I'm not sure. Everybody's got their opinions. And in 2017, when I came in, I was listening to those conversations. I was reading those conversations on social media, and but I was pretty busy. I was trying to learn, what does it take to live within the legislature? What does it take to be an MLA in my own riding? I understood the issues, of course, but I didn't understand much of the process. So much of my time was spent just learning the processes. But the politics, I don't know if it's true what they say about us. Did we lose our way? Did we lose touch? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't have an opinion on that. Because previous to 2017, I had no interest in politics. I actually refused to run for office a number of times for the federal government as well as the BC Liberals. I refused. But now that I'm coming in, if people truly want that change, Uh, I think my approach is different. I think the way I communicate what I believe in is different. Uh, and if that's what the people want, okay, great. And I do believe there's a way forward doing this uh, based on what has been done in the last 17 years, 18 years in BC. There were some really good things done in BC that we could build upon. The foundation is there. But where do we move now for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Do we become a Venezuela? Do we become a Detroit? Or do we become uh, a power in our own right, which is hard to do being a Western province? But if that's
It,
what BCers want, sure, great. That's where I come from. That's my background.
it is a hard thing being a Western province, so far from the centers of power. Though, of course, BC is the most populous of the four Western provinces, and certainly with its coastline has something to say. I think that with regards to what's happening even in British Columbia, and we're seeing this divide happen everywhere. We're seeing it in the States. We're seeing it throughout Europe and throughout the West. This kind of this crisis of identity and who's going to be in charge of what. As we look at the electoral map from 2020, the fall election in British Columbia that awarded the NDP a majority, we see that there's a lot of rural ridings that stayed blue, stayed BC Liberal, and a lot of urban ridings, even in the Bible Belt, as we call Abbotsford, etc., that went orange. What do you think got lost in that messaging, or how do we deliver a message that would bring those ridings back into the fold?
I'm not sure, and I've looked at this urban-rural divide, and it's a political ploy to talk about the urbans versus rurals, uh, because I believe that no matter where you come from, you're an Aboriginal, you're an immigrant, you're living in Vancouver, you're living up in Smithers. There's some basic things that make us all the same, and I keep repeating it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just people want to just build their lives. They just want to, and they want to have as affordable lives within reason. They want to be independent enough, just to own a chunk of property and raise their family. I mean, a lot of things I talk about uh, as an MLA, the majority of people have no interest in it. I mean, I don't blame them. I wasn't interested either, right? When I was before I became an MLA, I wasn't interested unless something specific that government did affected me directly. Then I became interested. But it's this. I don't believe in the rural urban. I don't believe in the ideologies that keep us separated. I think coming out of this COVID crisis, I think we should think about what's near and dear to each of us as individuals, and how do we sustain that or bring it back, for the future. Because I believe quality of life is really, it's not talked about enough, but I think it's going to be a big issue coming out of COVID if those jobs don't return, if the economy doesn't return. I think it's going to be a big topic, and it might take a while for the pain to set in, but you're already seeing the pain already because of the closure of, say, the tourism industry. The restaurants getting shut down. You're feeling the pain. Uh, Hopefully that's short term. But the real question is, how do we bring it back? I mean, the tourism industry alone, for example, and I learned this years ago when we did a study on tourism, and we found out that it was going to take a tremendous amount of money that we didn't have to develop a tourism industry in Kitimat. And so I was trying to think of a way, to get around this report that told us, we're up the creek without a paddle, basically. So I asked the guy, he said, what can I do then? There's got to be a way, to get around this so I can create a tourism industry in Kitimat. And the guy said, well, let's put it this way. You're competing with Disneyland and Vegas. What are you going to do to get that person that makes $200,000 a year, works 70 hours a week, and he has 2 weeks vacation to be with his family? What are you going to do to attract that person? And wow, yeah, good point. And so I just think if we're going to bring back our economy, we got to be bold about it. Is that me? That must have been me. We got to be bold about it. And if we're going to actually have these visions of how we come back, great. Let's have those conversations. But ultimately, you've also got to walk the talk.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. With your leadership bid, then it's interesting, right? Because both the way that just your background in life, how you've had to fight for your place at the table, and then the way that you've tried to make sure that you bring as many boats up with your own tide. Does that mean that populism has finally come to BC? We finally have a populist candidate in yourself, and then the vision would be that we have these grand projects come back like we had with WAC Bennett and with the way that we built infrastructure in BC before. Is that what you're hopeful for in your campaign if you win the leadership and eventually become premier?
Well, the legislation and the regulations of BC are going to basically restrict the amount of development we do in BC.
Hmm.
So those big projects, I doubt it. Not under the current regulation scheme and the legislation. If we're going to want to see those big projects again, especially linear projects, the regulations and the legislation is going to have to change. But this is why I'm putting more focus on regional projects. And every region of the province has got some potential in terms of project. And it's we go in there, we look at it, we review it, and we try cut as much red tape as we can. Because I don't think this government's going to change the legislation anytime soon, or the regulations that actually restrict, the big development. We're lucky. LNG Canada got approved before the legislation changed. Under the current legislation, I don't think this project would have been possible. So until that legislation gets changed, I think we're going to have to stick with the smaller projects. And I think that's a perfect opportunity for, say, a manufacturing plant. And by the way, ever since I started this, I'm getting requests from all over the world, investors that want to come in. They want to build something in BC. They want to build something in Skeena. And the world does want our resources, but they do understand that BCers now want to see some value added to their products before it leaves. So the investors are starting to come in now and say, okay, we see that, we understand that. So how can we make this happen? Because we still need your resource. We still need that. And so given the fact that we can't build these big multi-billion-dollar linear projects anymore, why don't we focus on these smaller projects, and maybe we get up 10 or 15 of these across BC, and we start building up the regions. And this could be in Surrey, it could be in Fort St. John, it could be in Skeena, it could be in Prince Rupert. I think this is the way that that they get the ball rolling until BC is ready to talk about major projects again.
How has been the reception to your leadership bid? Has it been positive? Has it been kind of mixed, or has it been refreshing for some people, again from all parts of the spectrum, to see that we finally have, of course, someone of First Nations descent running for the BC Liberals, as well as somebody who's talking about BC first and a growth policy for BC families?
Well, in rural ridings, I'm well known, I think, but I'm not very well known in urban ridings. So the support I'm getting is actually grassroots. I don't have any of the high level supporters that normally go with a leadership campaign. They've all joined other teams already, so I don't have that, and that's why you don't see anybody, any of the big names endorsing me. But I'm getting a tremendous amount of support from Facebook, from Twitter, and a lot of people are sending me messages on Messenger and whatnot. I'm getting a lot of support on LinkedIn, but these are just regular people. They're not people that are typically associated with leadership campaigns. I mean, the slick campaigns that you're going to see there that are well funded, I don't have that. I don't have those people that know how to put these campaigns together. So my question is, I appreciate all the support coming in, from all over BC, from just regular BCers. I really I appreciate that. But how do we get that converted into a vote? Which is a question I'm trying to grapple with right now. And I do a lot of the people that are forwarding their support to me on Messenger are basically saying yes. You know, I'm 26 years old. Um, I need a future. I can't afford a house. I need a good paying job. So I support what you're saying. Not even getting some of the older crowd coming in and, my age, talking about that. That's great. We got to get back to values, and we got to get back to principles, and, we got to get back to true leadership. And so it's actually a strange situation for me to be in, because I'm not quite sure how a leadership campaign is supposed to be run. But I'm lucky. I've got a few people that understand the mechanics of it, and they're helping put it together for me.
And this is kind of the quintessential point, right? When it comes to leadership campaigns of any kind, it's funny because in Canada, almost worse than the United States, because I mean we've seen insurgent candidates come to the fore in the United States. In Canada, it has become kind of like, well, you have to pay the right lobbyist or the right consultant, and that's how you make your way forward. I really hope that that's not the case here in British Columbia, and I think you stand a real chance from a groundswell, so long as the groundswell isn't just sustainable, but they feel like they're getting that feedback and they're part of a movement. I think that's a good movement to be a part of.
Well, I hope so. It wasn't something I thought up for the campaign, right? Everything I've talked about is just the way I thought for the last 10 years, 15 years. And it was, I guess it's just a regular BCer, to just understanding, the politics, the layout of the land in terms of the economy, and ultimately society. I don't think people understand, how important it is to talk about society when you're talking about an economy, or when you're talking about legislation. The society we have here in BC is actually pretty good. It's a caring society. It's an independent society, but that can go all the way if you don't pay attention to what actually sustains a society. And that's always been my goal, to make sure that a person, can basically build their own life independent from government. Just be able to go out there and succeed. And the good thing about BC and Canada, you have the choice to succeed, and you have the choice not to succeed. You have the choice. And this is what I find all across all demographics. No matter what your religion is, no matter if you're urban, rural, doesn't matter if you're First Nation or not, you all have that choice to work hard and sacrifice. And you know that's the best pathway to success.
No, I mean it's an old message. It's the true one. It's always the true principle, but it's a reassuring thing to hear it again, because I think sometimes, especially through what's happened with COVID, and I'm not saying at all that people didn't need help. I needed help. I got laid off, but at the same time, it just that the idea that somehow we're just going to throw money at things and that'll all go away and everything will be fine. The economy is the economy. That's what drives the nation. With kind of as we close here, Ellis, what do you think is the first thing? If tomorrow we finally get out of lockdown, or everything finally goes right, or we say we get into fall, we're past the waves, everything's finally evened out. What do we need to see concretely in British Columbia for things to just kind of start back up again?
Well, I think ultimately you got to bring those jobs back. You got to bring the economy back. I mean, for a number of different reasons, and I think this could get ahead a lot quicker with the investments from government, sound investments from government, by the way, not just money out the door, investments from the private sector, uh, because the jobs and the economy provide so much, not only for the well-being of a family or an individual, but also revenues to government. And for those that aren't paying attention to what government's doing, deficits are a fact of life now here in Canada. and that's going to lead to debt. And so your government's going to go out and borrow money to offset the deficit. Well, if all you're doing is paying off the interest or just paying off the deficit with no real plan to actually get rid of the deficit or actually raise enough revenues to pay down the deficit, then somebody down the line is going to have to pay that deficit off. Somebody, and you're going to pay for it. Millennials most likely are the ones who are going to have to pay this deficit off in terms of programs getting cut or taxes going up. But somebody's going to have to pay. And does this affect quality of life? Yeah, because some government down the line is going to have to make some really tough decisions when the deficit becomes unmanageable. When your credit rating, your AAA credit rating, when that starts to disappear, you start to pay more interest. And this goes back to what happens when you hire too many or elect too many politicians instead of electing people that understand the basics of governance, understand the basics of budgeting, understand the basics of revenues versus liabilities. And we're heading down this road. Both the Canadian government as well as the BC government. The proposed projected deficit for BC is $15 billion. And I heard that was a conservative estimate. Right? So I really think the first thing to be thought about is, okay, if you want that deficit to be offset or even, some hope that you're going to pay it off somehow, then you got to start thinking about kickstarting your economy. Even more so that you did, if you did it all, which I doubt will happen in BC in the last 3 years, you got to think about kickstarting your economy. So not only can you bring back those individuals and families paying jobs, but you can actually offset your deficits.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to kind of leave it, because the truth of the matter is that if we don't face those things, we're not going to have a future here in British Columbia, and I appreciate you recognizing that. Again, I've been speaking with Ellis Ross. He is a leadership candidate for the BC Liberal Party here in British Columbia, which is our right-of-center party for those in the prairies in Alberta that don't know about that. And, of course, he is the member for Skeena. Thank you so much for joining us, Ellis.
Thanks a lot, Nathan.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to do a quick little transition here. We do have an in-house guest again today. This is a live show, and we don't have any commercials. We don't have Tucker's money yet. We'll get there eventually, I'm sure. We'll get a crane cam and have things rolling around. So please don't leave us as we fade to black for just a minute and rearrange the set slightly, bring on our next guest, and we'll be underway in just a moment. We're bringing on Sean Ollech, who is going to be talking to us about pro-life issues as well as demographics when it comes to Canada, BC, and the world. Alrighty, so that was our quick scene change. I was in theater briefly as a kid, so I kind of know a little bit about the whole blocking thing that happens when it just fades to black. I mean, that's live too. We can all survive that. I think we'll get commercials at some point. Don't worry. So in any case, I'm here with Sean Ollech. Sean Ollech, of course, is a local guy here in BC's northern capital. Of course, we're broadcasting to you live from Prince George. And today we're going to be talking about pro-life issues as well as just demography And so how kind of a concrete example of the fact that when you look at pro-life issues and the idea of whether or not children are carried to term, the fact of the matter is it has real life consequences in British Columbia. And so, that's all part of that equation. And we're gonna talk about that a little bit. I'm gonna move your microphone just a little bit here, Sean. Make sure that people can see your face. Yeah, and you'll just speak right into the microphone. And you'll be ready to roll. Okay, that's better. Yeah. And just being brought up. There we go. And so, Sean, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with?
That's kind of a really long, interesting story. I went to the University of British Columbia, and I was in a dorm with a very kind lady named Stephanie Gray. I'm sure many here in British Columbia have heard of her. She's probably been the most prominent pro-life activist to come out of here. So she went to the same dorm as I went to. And when I was at UBC, she had just started up with a little table display.
Mm-hmm.
You know, cute babies, let's save the babies. You know, nothing you could walk down the street, nobody would care. But two people, Aaron Kaiser and John Chandler at the University of British Columbia, put her display. And that was news at the University of British Columbia for week. It was in all the campus papers and everything. So I'm looking through the campus papers and I'm going, wow, I know this lady. They're actually talking about somebody that I know, not just somebody on the other side of campus that, you know, we've never heard about or cared about. So I decided to go and talk with her and ask her, well, what's the big deal?
Yeah, what is the big deal?
You know, why it's just, you know, these cute babies on this display. I'd never had any contact experience with any of it. Nobody had told me nothing about this. And here I was going to college. You think that you're reasonably informed about matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked her, and she was kind of quite tired at this point because I'm sure everybody was, you know, she's media sensation and all that. So she asked me, and she said, well, are you willing to follow the truth wherever it leads you? And at that point, I wasn't a Christian. I wasn't somebody who was remotely affiliated with anything pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought I was somebody who was an honest observer, somebody willing to challenge my own thoughts. And that's why I was at university, to learn what other people had to say. I'd grown up in Prince George. I'd never really known much of a life outside of it. So this is kind of me stepping out into a larger world, different perspectives. So I said, you know what, I'm game. Let's see where this goes.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that has been a large part of my life, trying to show other people that it's not just about these, you know, crazy people in the church, all these Bible thumpers, you know, because it's a bigger issue. It doesn't just touch the little old lady down in the street, and it's not just about people holding signs, protesting about all the hospitals and that. But, you know, one thing I look at this is, have you read Olek?
I have heard of him, but I've not perused him very deeply.
Olek talks about the loss of a generation. He was one of those people like Tolkien and other people who served in the First World War. And he survived it, and unlike Siegfried Sassoon and other writers at the time. But his big thing is he lost a generation. The best of our generation was at Vimy, was at Passchendaele, was at Ypres, all of these areas. And that, you know, they felt that they, the survivors, were the cowards because all the bravest people were out there, you know, they got shot down first. We're in that. There are 2 million people in Canada alone that are not here because of abortion since 1988. That's more than we lost in World War I. So when we see Olek talking about the loss of a generation, the loss of all these wonderful people, men specifically, who would have gone on to be the leaders of society, they're gone. We're in that today.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about before, Sean, is that Canada hasn't had a big graduating class since the 50s, that it's changed, that that while there are more people in Canada today, the fact of the matter is, demographically speaking, that it's actually still a shrinking population. It's only supplemented by, I think, immigration.
If you go to any high school here, they will show their graduating classes on the walls. The largest cohort in Canada was 1956. So we are 60 some years past that now.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go now, it's going to be something like a third, a quarter, fewer than they were back in 1956. So it's not just us though. Worldwide, the largest, if you look at graduating classes or cohorts in that, was 2007. So people don't realize that. We are 13 years past if you look at a crest. And we keep hearing, oh, there's overpopulation. We're going to run out of resources. That's not the truth. And I have heard very few people talking about that other than maybe the last few years.
I think something that people need to understand a little bit better when it comes to the whole pro-life issue is that it is this slippery slope sort of thing that we've already lived out. So right now, we obviously have the euthanasia debate, which is expanding to include people who have mental illness and no terminal illness. And that's a whole nother kind of thing. We can get into that in a moment. But the fact of the matter is that whenever any of this legislation comes forward, though admittedly in Canada there is no legislation, it was simply struck down by the Supreme Court, and people forget that as well, people say, well, this is a slippery slope. Well, the advocates, or those who, we can say radicals. I do bring radicals on this show, so I don't want to really use it too much as a pejorative, and people call me radical as well. So, I have to own this term as much as I can. But nonetheless, I would just say that obviously the people who are at least in favor of these new policies always say, well, that this is just pearl clutching by the right, by the religious right. People on the religious right are just making hay out of nothing. These are already inherent rights. We're just going to codify them. And yet, slowly but surely, we always seem to wander down a road where things do get more more difficult. And things do get more inhuman. People used to say safe, legal, and rare. Now it's on demand without apology. What is the strategy then inside the pro-life movement and other movements that are at least trying to, regardless of their religious affiliation, just trying to agitate for a more human world where this isn't a choice that anyone has to make or wants to make, and possibly even shouldn't be allowed to make? How do pro-life movements articulate that?
They lost me 20 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm not the only one out there who's come from that background. I have a very good friend of mine who's coming into the church just this Easter, who also comes from a similar background, and like your friend Ellis happens to be an Indigenous person. We have a communication issue, and that's a major thing in the media. It's all, you'll see pro-life people portrayed a particular way, that we all make a particular stereotype, that, they're all, like I said, Bible thumping evangelicals, so on and so forth, or, Catholic people for that matter. That's all we ever hear. We never hear the other side of it. We never hear, pro-lifers coming out and saying, hey, we have a problem here. We are losing significant portions of our society. Why don't we have someone saying that this is the problem? Someone going out and being the voice in the wilderness, so to speak. That's what I see, at least in the time that I've been there, is that we have a hard time getting past that barrier that we're taking right away from people. That's not what we're doing. All we're doing is saying that everyone deserves an opportunity to live their life. We do not have a right to take that away from anyone. And I think that's also part of the communication message, because we're seen as the people of no, that no, you can't do this. No, you can't have an abortion. No, you can't go out and do the things that you want to do. But that's not really what we're saying. All we're saying is that with rights come responsibilities. So you do not have a right to go and kill someone, for example, because that takes that person's own rights away. And I don't think we've really articulated that well, because it's hard to look at a child in the womb as an individual, as someone who has their own rights. We just see them as some nebulous piece of tissue,
right?
The usual nomenclature.
Yeah. I think, obviously, this is a difficult topic. I mean, we have, people are bigger and lesser fans of this topic, but I think that ultimately it's another thing that's not, I mean, for example, if we want to look at it from a political point of view, as to if someone were to ask me, well, why are you even having this discussion? The thing that I would probably highlight the most is that most recently, it was the pro-life coalition that brought Erin O'Toole to heel at the Tory leadership convention. Well, not the Tory leadership convention, sorry, but the Tory convention. So there was a policy being put forward. There are a few policies, and they failed because the Coalition for Life and others, people who are on the religious right, the social conservatives, came together and said no to various policies, which actually is pretty rare. This was actually noted for those of you who've been tuning in all week. We had Stuart Parker on yesterday. He had a great piece, if you want to find it on his blog, as to what that really meant, as being the only party in the modern world, the Canadian Conservative Party, that had its own constituents actually rise up and say no to something. That everywhere else, this is a fait accompli. Whenever you put a policy up, it just gets approved. Somehow in Canada, of all places, the Tories managed to seize the moment and push back against their own leadership, when usually there is no pushback. To this point, though, obviously it's a powerful coalition within the party. How come they don't seem to be able to get either their people into the leadership class or get a win to elections in the general?
I'm going to say a few controversial things about this that are not only controversial among the larger political standpoint, but within pro-life people in general. There's a few people out there.
We only have two rules on this show: no swearing and no denying historical facts.
We won't do that yet. No, I have my own perspective on it. I think by and large, pro-lifers did not have an effective strategy in the leadership race. I feel they needed to back Derek Sloan because also because of his age and his qualifications. You want to get them when they're first term MP, when they're getting out there and they're just getting their feet under them, because these are the people that become people like Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker did not start out as, party leader. He ran twice. He failed twice. And then on his third shot, even after he thought that his time has passed, that's when his opportunity came. So Sloan was that person for us. And we did not do an effective job of getting Sloan in. From the people that I sit with, this pro-life coalition, the person that we see as our future is Leslie Lewis. Now, the issue I have with that is I do not feel that she is an effective communicator, that people are with her because they see her for what the boxes that she checks. And I know I'm going to be very harsh about that here, rather than for her ability to convince people to be on board with that. And I think that's the issue also with the BC Liberal Party. Vander Zalm became premier because he was an effective communicator. He was able to reach out to people and explain to them why he should be leader. Was Andrew Wilkinson that guy?
No, he was not.
Gordon Campbell?
Well, Gordon Campbell did get what he got.
Is there anybody out there who would talk about his amazing charisma the way they still talk about
they talk about his drinking and driving. From Hawaii, to be clear. That's a real thing. That happened. Right? It's like,
leaders need to lead.
Yes, they do. No question.
And is Erin O'Toole doing that?
Not according to me, probably. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. I guess in my own opinion, when it comes to Erin O'Toole, I feel like he might have been a decent compromise candidate. And then I think it was in his first press conference, it seemed like he threw the social conservatives under the bus pretty hard.
Yeah, he basically said, we don't need your votes. You are completely locked in our column. So all we have to do is make sure we get enough people in Quebec and Ontario to support the party, and then, we're going to return to power, and it's going to be happy days again. I don't see that.
No, I don't either.
He's minus 25 in Saskatchewan. So that's, even though he's not yet underwater there, the party itself is getting 52% of support in Saskatchewan at the same time that Aaron O'Toole is minus 25 in opinion polls. That's not going to last. Something has to give. Either the people who are supporting the Conservative Party, who have for years and years, say enough is enough, or O'Toole steps down. I think, honestly, the best thing he could do to help us defeat Trudeau this election is to do the honorable thing and say the people will not vote for me.
I mean, that's a hot take, but you're entitled to it on this show. We're not censoring you for that. The thing that kind of comes to me, I guess, is it's funny because we had a mutual colleague of ours, Mr. Clare, on yesterday, and of course he explained to us in no uncertain terms that there were to be no splits. I believe that's how the old leader said it. Sir John A. Let us have no splits was his way of putting forward that the campaign needed to be as focused as possible and get somewhere good. I think that when it comes to conservatism in Canada, maybe we can pivot to this a little bit before, and we'll come back to the question of social conservatism in Canada. The thing is that because we're trying to not be the United States, the problem becomes that we have to articulate kind of an old Tory version, a thrown and altar Tory version of conservatism. And a lot of people, now that we all watch movies that are made in the States and shows that are made in the States and consume American media, don't really understand what a thrown and altar Toryism would be. They don't know who Burke is, right? They don't know who Richard Hooker is. They don't even know who George Grant is. And George Grant only died a couple of years back, at least by the numbers I was using there, compared to the people I was referring to before. And I think that there's just a serious lack of kind of cultural depth to conservatism in Canada outside of kind of sort of little pockets, like people who are of Scottish heritage feel a very strong attachment to that part of kind of a Tory high culture, though admittedly, of course, Scotland is now mostly Labour. The other part of it that maybe you find it elsewise is if you're in the prairies, we've got people tuning in from the prairies. A lot of the, what I think Pat Buchanan called white ethnics is basically the best way to say it, right? So, I mean, I come from that stock, adopted wise. My mother is Mennonite. So there's enclaves, right? And Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox, like this. So there's these enclaves all over the place that have fairly conservative ideals as part of religion, part of family life. Mm-hmm. But how do we articulate it as a cultural movement? Obviously, a lot of it shows up in the pro-life movement itself. But how does that coalesce into a strong solidarity, a strong force in electoral politics in Canada?
This is a long topic. I wrote an article on this a while ago, specifically looking at conservative authors here. Most people can name maybe one or two. And that has been a problem with the conservative movement for a long time. Like somebody like Diefenbaker would come and talk about it as a problem back then, because what happened is they got swept out after the Great Depression, and they were at a really serious loss of identity. That's why they merged with Bracken and progressives, even though philosophically they don't really have a lot in common. Ask people today who Bracken is, no one knows who he is. And even people who are educated in the field don't know anything about who he is. I go through the list of people who would have been considered prominent conservative authors in terms of what does Canadian Toryism mean. Nobody's heard of them. And the reason they're not being heard is because they've been effectively banished from the universities. Nobody wants to hear about Tories from the 19th century or the earlier 20th century, because this is not considered to be part of Canada's political identity. And I think for conservatives here in Canada, what has happened is we've offloaded our conservative thinking to Americans. but the Republic is not Canada. And Canadian conservatism has certain features that don't translate well. And I
like
think
a fundamental idea, say, in the Commonwealth or the common good.
yes, like the Commonwealth, like what you talk about, thistles, shamrock, rose, and twined.
Mhm.
People from Diefenbaker's generation would understand the cultural baggage that comes along with it, and he'd probably be quite amused to see two former Protestant turned Catholics commentating about the state of conservatism in Canada, because he would probably see that as a significant change in where they were in his day.
Yeah. Yes, because I mean, of course, just like any other 19th century country, for the most part, if you had a parliamentary or republican system or electoral system in period, you would see the electoral results follow effectively cultural religious lines, all but to a T. A couple of swings here and there, but that was it. That would determine. We all know the way Ireland was going to vote. We all knew the way that Quebec was going to vote. So, and to this day, we still see some of that, right? I think that maybe a way to pivot this back to the pro-life question is that this is another place where people are just kind of woefully ignorant of history. It really wasn't that long ago. 1988, all prohibitions against abortion are struck down in Canada by the Supreme Court, which is literally admitted to later by the justices who were there at that decision. Some of them have fully confessed that they had political problems with the law as it stood, and that's why they voted the way they did. And that's you'd think that was unconscionable for a jurist to not think through just the legal ramifications of that, but there it is. And so we don't have a law in this country. What we have are healthcare mandates, I believe, that determine basically when a child, to use the pro-life terms, when a child will be killed, to use more clinical terms, when a unborn fetus will be terminated. Mm-hmm. And the point is that those are the only things that really limit things in this country are at a provincial level. They have nothing to do with criminality. They're just healthcare mandates within, and they're kept very under wraps.
I want to speak a little bit more about this because there hasn't been a lot said about it. In most provinces, not all, PEI is an exception. Abortion is funded through the medical services plan.
Public.
Completely public, but it is not transparent. We cannot get accurate abortion statistics in this country. That if you just want to ask the question, how many people got an abortion in all of Canada this year, you will not find that information. What we have done, some of us, myself included and others, we have been tracking their number and we have ways of getting this information, but you won't find it. There's not people going on here. You can't look it up on a website and say, well, this is how many abortions were done. This is despite the fact that every single one of them that are done here in Canada are publicly funded. The public has a right to know.
Mm-hmm. They absolutely have a right to know. I mean, if the government was funding anything else, I mean, like this was always the thing that I brought up with people who are kind of the other side of the spectrum, right? Like I'm not pro-war by any means, but if the government was fighting a secret war and hiding all the money they were spending on the war, like I would have a lot of sympathy for that argument, right? And I think that's kind of maybe the way the two sides can agree. It's like whatever the empire is up to, the evil empire that we all live under in secular society, we would like to know what they're up to. And whether it's funding abortions or funding bombs, we don't agree with that for the most part. So let's do something about it. I think this is a primary example of exactly why accountability is important, Sean. And we need to have an accountability system within our government on this question specifically, but on all questions, because it's very clear that, I mean, why are they hiding it if they're not afraid of it? There's a good question.
Well, let's even something else, for example, let's say this government was funding something like clitorectomies.
Yes. Genital mutilation.
How would somebody go and say that, hey, we don't think this is a good use of public dollars? So this isn't a pro-life issue. This is a transparency issue. And as you said, an accountability issue. If people are paying for it with their taxpayer dollars, they have a right to know how many abortions are done in this country. They should not have to jump through hoops. All they should have to do is look it up on Stats Canada.
Yeah, the same way we look up salaries, the same way we look up what was spent on infrastructure, etc. So I mean, that's all kind of some of the context. Conservatism in Canada, sort of still in the wasteland, still wandering basically in its 1930s milieu, and with some of its 1980s neoliberalism spiced into it, and now with some populism, I guess, coming out of the 21st century in pieces, depending on where you are. But they continue to rule like part of the establishment once they get elected. Doug Ford, I think, being the primary example, came in looking like big tough guy. I'm going to be the Canadian Trump. Even had a monosyllable last name, and quickly became as establishment as, especially through COVID, right? Establishment technocratic as say John Tory, the mayor, right?
If you don't have a concrete political philosophy that informs what your actions are going to be, you are not going to produce any coherent political strategy.
No,
ever. It doesn't matter. I mean, we can talk about Kim Campbell, same problem. And we have, even that was a criticism going back to the Mulroney days, that he did not have a political philosophy that anybody could hang anything on to. So the last person I can really say of here in Canada that had a concrete political philosophy is the same person we keep talking about here in British Columbia. That was Bill Vanderzon. He knew what he stood for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question he knew what he was doing. I think that if we're going to try and articulate this when it comes to Canadian conservatism, maybe one of the ways forward there is to kind of try and at least figure out what we aren't. We're trying to not be the Liberals, at least. Well, let's be clear. Politically, right now, we're trying to court who the Liberals court, and that's not going to work. So I don't know if Aaron's watching this live stream, but Aaron, that's not going to work. Like just free piece of advice there. But the point being that if we're not supposed to be the Liberal Party, which as far as I can tell, really, I mean, it actually hasn't changed that much. It actually is kind of, it's not unlike the Democratic Party in the United States in the sense like it's never apologized for any of its mistakes. It'll apologize for the country, but it won't apologize for the absolutely egregious abuses that it's participated in. And finally, like, again, if we're going to use George Grant at least as a measuring stick, or even just use of course, what happened in 65 and 67, we lost our flag and got this new weird looking maple leaf thing that doesn't, God bless anybody who's ever been buried under it, God rest them. But I mean that the actual flag itself is just an emblem. It doesn't have any history or meaning to it. And second of all, when of course we kind of refounded this country in 67 in our centennial and decided that we were going to become whatever Pearson and Trudeau had floating in their heads that day, because I guess, that was fine for secularists to do that. But the fact that we were doing that with Augustine and Aquinas at other epochs, that's not okay. But anyways, that's enough of that rant. The point being that we had this pivot, right? But this kind of technocratic party, as George Grant called them, like we did kind of just give ourselves as an American vassal state of technocracy.
That hasn't changed. They were known as the natural governing party for a reason. Mm-hmm. And that was just true under Mackenzie King as it was under either Trudeau. They had this sense that they know better than you how to live your life, how to govern your life, and whatever you had for the last year. The same people going out there telling you that they can make your decisions better than you can yourself.
And it didn't matter what it was. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. Like, it's incredible how far, like, I'm not a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I think it's something that separates me from some of my fellow cohort at this platform is I'm not a libertarian. I am a conservative. There are times where I'm an ultramontane radical, but that's a different question altogether. I'm a conservative. And the thing is that I just still boggles my mind, still from maybe you can use the libertarian perspective, that like the government's in everything from the air we breathe to our toilet. Like it's everywhere. And it's just mind boggling. Like it's mind boggling. And it's multiple layers of government. It's like, why? Like who cares? Like who cares what they think? Like run the highways better. Like it's just,
for anyone out there who wants a primer, I think, to get an idea of what books they should be reading, I would completely recommend Road to System.
Right. Hayek. Yeah.
By Hayek, because I read that 5 years ago, and more true now than then. And it's funny to watch the evolution of his own thought when he writes about his book. And he said, he thought his book was rubbish. I mean, he was an economist. He wanted to write more, serious work. And then 20 years down the line, he said, "This is the best book I've ever written."
Yes. I mean, I guess the short version for our viewers and listeners is that, of course, The Road to Serfdom essentially articulates how you go from a free society back into a completely controlled one, or outright totalitarian. I mean, different interpretations as to what exactly Hayek was pointing at. But I think the short version is that ultimately what makes society human, and for progressives, we can reference Aldous Huxley here, right? That the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. You can either have a human world or an inhuman one. The same thing here is that, of course, you can either have the spontaneous society, the society where a huge amount of liberty is conceded, and therefore people organize themselves, and that's where all our culture comes from, and our cultural celebrations come from, and family life, etc. And of course, our civil society, the little platoons, as Burke called them, the intermediaries between the sovereign and the subject, as Alexis de Tocqueville called them, that all disappears because the middleman of middle society, all of that goes away. All of that makes life rich goes away because life is just regimented and organized, and there's nothing but productivity or whatever, and there's no place for spontaneity and creativity. And I think we see this with COVID especially. I mean, what's happened with COVID is just absolutely egregious with the amount of what the lockdowns have done, right? They've canceled everything. They've even canceled the secular versions of these things, right? Like, I mean, at least the secularists had, their things to do, right? But it's a great irony, right? Like, well, whatever. I'm not throwing believers or non-believers onto the bus. I'm just saying that regardless of whether us on the moral right didn't agree with what those celebrations were, we probably still mostly agree that you might have the right to have those celebrations, and they're gone. All of it's gone.
Well, just the other day, we have a double fence placed outside Grace Church in Alberta. This is in the West. This is supposed to be the free West. Now, one of the people that helped bring me over into Christian faith were some of my Russian Mennonite friends who came over from the Soviet Union. I heard their stories. I heard what they told that the government said and do, and told them what they could and could not worship. And one of the best things to see on their faces was their just pure joy that they could go to services on Sunday.
Yeah.
In a free country.
In a free country.
That was 20 years ago.
Well, things have changed in 20 years, haven't they? I mean, I think that's something that's very, very distinct about what's happened throughout the 21st century. I'm trying to imagine, I mean, I don't know how old or young our viewership is or our listeners, but I'm just trying to imagine my own time as I turned 10 on when the world was supposed to end on Y2K. I'm a New Year's baby. I didn't win the prize, but I turned 10, and I'm trying to think back to, at least what I can remember of the 90s. And I'm looking back and thinking to myself, having been raised in the church my whole life, I'm trying to imagine how my parents would have reacted, or I would have reacted even as a child, to the idea that I couldn't go to church or that my school was closed. I'm trying to imagine, even fathoming that. But somehow through the 21st century, I think starting with September 11th, we've just become a more militarized society that is more controlled. 2008 didn't help with the recession, and then new rules that came in through that. Oil crash hasn't helped, and now we have COVID, and so we have these kind of this multi-triumvirate system. Depending on where you're looking at, the .com bust is something that you experienced because you're a little bit older than I am. What does it mean?
Yes and no. I would probably disagree with your assessment of 9/11. Now, the idea mostly behind 9/11, Mark Stein talks a lot about this, was a wake-up call for the West, that there are societies out there that do not like Western ways, Western ideas, Western freedoms. The most liberals will look at it as, that everybody should love us. Everybody should want to do the things that we do. And they have a hard time dealing with societies that have a very different perspective on human rights and freedoms. Probably the last 20 years, and this is going to sound strange from a conservative, we've gotten away from this liberal perspective that the West has values that freedoms are important and that they are concrete things. We've moved
the ACLU before it got woke is what you're saying.
Before it got woke, yeah.
It was defending pornographers.
Yeah. So, but we are now in a society that your children in your school today can open up the history textbooks, and the first thing they know about the founder of this country, Sir John A., is that he was a white supremacist. This is not a viable future for this country. If we are teaching children who come here that they need to hate the country as it was founded, where are they going to get their ideals from? They're not going to get it from Canada. They're going to get it from everywhere else. And that is what we are seeing. So if we're worried about things from 9/11 with certain cultures coming in and saying that, hey, we don't really like these Western freedoms. And now you walk around today and can't find anyone without a mask.
No, I think there's something else that has to be pointed out here is, quite frankly, that not only has there been this lack of Canadian enculturation and a positive way of doing Canadian enculturation, but again, when we look at even just that conservative element in Canada as well, what does it mean to be a conservative in Canada? And for that matter, even on the religious right, like we may be able to agree on the creed and on, well, this is the story of Christianity and all the rest of it, but how many of us, even when it comes to the question of abortion, really understand that it comes down to the inherent dignity of every human being, and when two humans come together, they create another human being. Like, they don't create a puppy, they don't create a tree.
We have a leader today in the United States who can walk up into the church, who will openly say that abortion is a part of the creed. This is what we're up against. So it's not just people allowing us spaces to do what we need to do, to worship or whatnot. Those people are now telling us, this is what your creed teaches. Mm-hmm. And for those of us going and saying that, no, this is wrong. This is what the church has always taught. We have an obligation to go and say that this is wrong. It's always been wrong. It's never going to be right. There's never going to be a right side of history about any of this. You're always going to be on the other side.
We have one comment here from, I'm just going to call her Kim for short, I think. But conservatives haven't conserved anything, from Punish Kim there on YouTube. I think that was actually an interesting point that was made not too long ago by somebody to me, that conservatives are just progressives who drive the speed limit.
Exactly. They've been that way since back, and that hasn't changed.
And this is kind of a problem inside of conservatism, because I think we're not supposed to just be old fashioned. This isn't about just keeping things as if they're still, 1929 or something, right? That's not what's at issue here. It's about that there are these core values and they can only be preserved if certain cultural practices are preserved. And that's what's going by the wayside.
These are universals. These are not something that, Victorian era morality, so to speak. What conservatives need to be able to come up and say that freedoms, are universal. They apply to everyone, everywhere, at every time. And when's the last time you heard a conservative come up and say that? Not here in Canada, not for quite some time. So in terms of conservative not conserving anything, that reminds me of a quote from Chesterton. He talks about the dictatorship of the dead, as he put it. And that's a radical notion, that we are not entitled to change the things that have been handed down to us. So,
yeah, democracy of the dead, yeah.
Democracy of the dead, yeah. So we look at things as if they have come down to us and that we can change them, we can make them, mold them into what we feel they ought to be. But that's not the way it is. Many of these things that have come down to us have been passed down through millennia. We do not have the right to suddenly say, hey, we're not going to do this anymore. You said we're going to change the world into this brave new world.
I think that when it comes to those, when it comes to this concept of how things have changed so quickly in such a short amount of time, is ultimately there is a rootlessness, right? There's a rootlessness. One of the things that I have worked really hard on in the course of my life since I graduated from university was trying to stay here at home, have a sense of home. I did not envy my friends who were far more successful than I financially, career-wise, personally, professionally. They were far more successful than I, but they left their homes, and I saw what it did to them. I saw what it did to their souls. I saw how hard it was. I'm not saying there is never a reason to leave. There is, and I also understand that people get forced into very desperate situations. I'm not excusing that, but I think that in something that else has been lost, something else that's been lost, really through modernity in general, but certainly since mass transportation and mass society, and also since the cost of living has started to skyrocket, is the idea that you just have to do whatever you can to make the dollar, and that's going to come at the cost of your family. It's going to come at the cost of where you grew up. And how can you preserve the values of your home and of your home culture, even your ethnic background, perhaps, right? Like to participate in the things that matter to your particular background. How can you do that if you're being always ripped away from where you were raised, and you can't have that belonging, that sustainability there?
It's not a new problem. My own family left Germany to come to Canada before the First World War, and thank goodness for that, because they were right in the middle of a war. But it only was recently that we were able to go back and see the homestead, see where my family came from. And the only reason that was ever preserved is because they were on the right side of the line. If they were further north in near what's now Kaliningrad, everything would have been rubble, because that's what Russia did when they came in and they took over everything after the Second World War. So it's only because of the Polish people in Poland that preserved these things from the Germans that we were still able to go back and to your family, because they had these values that it was important to keep these things. Do we have those values in Canada? I don't see it. I see this rootlessness. Everybody comes from all the places that they're here from wherever they were, and they're here in Canada for a while, and then they leave, they go back to wherever they've been, but there's never any concrete connection to a place. So, I mean, I left myself. I went part in the United States, came back, and I realized that when I came back that, yeah, it's very different when you're in far away from home where you grew up, where your family's from. And I felt the same as you, that now I'm back, I need to stay.
And I think that something that comes to my mind is another work, if we're looking for things on conservatism or what conservatism might be, regardless if it's Canadian or more colloquial elsewhere, is, of course, I'll Take My Stand. I believe that was written by the Southern agrarians during the Roaring '20s, so a century ago. And that was written as an homage to the fact that people were all moving to the city. They were participating in rootlessness. This was the great kind of awakening in the postbellum South, as well as after the Great War, and then with the great rise in economics that happened after the war and the burgeoning middle class just before the crash. And they write this, it was a series of essays by various Southern agrarians who had no truck with the idea of slavery and that sort of thing. Obviously, it had been gone for over a generation, almost 3 generations at that point. But they argued that, their grandfather and his grandfather before him had all lived on this land. And so they were going to continue to live on this land, and they were going to do their best to preserve the land and be here and be a part of the folk, as it were, of this place and of this time. And I think that this is always a conflict inside of conservatism. I mean, we have Manchester liberalism, right? We have the idea of rip and ship, the idea of let's build, and go. And then we have, of course, that more preservationist side of conservatism, the conserving part of conservatism. And these things have been in tension since the 19th century. Is there a way forward there, a way to solve that equation?
I would love to see something come out from, especially from people like Ellis, and where he's from and where he's grown up, and from some of the conservatives here. When's the last time you heard a conservative extol the virtues of the farm?
Yes.
In this country. So I haven't heard it. And it's generally assumed that all the Western prairie populists will be in this column forever. And I think people are really starting to get tired of feeling taken for granted.
Well, two parties were born out of that exact question, right? The Socreds were born out of that question, and so was the CCF, the Common Federation.
I don't think people like Ellis are going to be able to form that connection with this former Socred, with these people in there that are the heart and soul of the party, always have been, unless he's willing to go out and say that this is something that's valuable. We need to preserve this. A lot of times we're so fast to say, hey, well, this is the group we should be going after. We should pivot after, the city folks in Ontario. We've heard it time and time again. But it would be nice to get a little gratitude, because these people have voted conservative for 40, 50 years, many of them. And when's the last time they got a thank you?
Or seem to get anything out of it. I mean, especially considering if we're talking about farming specifically, the corporate interests kind of come to mind, right, with Monsanto and that sort of thing, and the things that have happened in the prairies. And the other thing that comes to mind is that even a divide and conquer mentality surrounds farming. What ranchers get out of farming versus what dairy farmers get out of farming are two very different things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that has to change as well. I'm sure I could get into trouble on this particular platform, sharing some of my harshest opinions when it comes to the dairy lobby. I certainly don't like that it's exclusive and a monopoly. But ultimately, the bigger thing for me is that all farmers need to be given a fair shake.
Mm-hmm.
And why hasn't a conservative government done that yet? Why haven't conservative governments done more to ensure that the farmer is taken care of? Here in BC, I mean, if we're really wandering around here today, but that's okay. That's what we're here to do.
We have an hour to wander around.
It's a live stream. That's what happened. In British Columbia, like I was mentioning this the other day, my parents have a farm, and they tried to make a secondary residence on the farm, and they were given a stop work order. And we're in a fight with the regional district. The regional district wants like $1,500 to discuss this, and it doesn't mean the appeal will be successful. It's at lockup. It's sitting there. It's an empty building, not yet plumbed, not yet electrified, and we're just fighting with the regional district. Meanwhile, you can build a tennis court in an urban area, no problem, or you can put a carriage house over your garage and then call that a mortgage helper. That might be the most insidious term I've ever heard. If you use the word mortgage helper, stop. Not joking. Don't say that. That is. I'm going to say it. It's disgusting. Don't use that term.
We had some of our land taken away by Ducks Unlimited.
Well, there you go.
Given a take it or leave it offer so they could have their wetlands preserved. So I'm sure there's farmers out there who've had similar experiences over the years dealing with bureaucracy and land ownership. And we don't really own our land here.
No, we don't. I think in Alberta, they own the minerals under it. They have rights to that. But other than that, in Canada, we're just all leasing from the Crown, which is being administered by some rather contemptible people. The issue coming back to, again, where does say conservatism go from here? Where does even Canada go from here? I think that the fundamental point at hand is there hasn't been a vision for the country in a long time.
Not since Diefenbaker.
No.
Harper didn't really articulate much of a
didn't.
vision. He wasn't a visionary.
No, he was an administrator,
mm-hmm.
a good one.
Mm-hmm.
A good one, though. The further we get away from that time period, the more red that government looks to me. I wish they would have cut what they needed to cut, or pivoted Canada as they needed to pivot, and done what needed to be done. But instead, the Laurentian consensus remained all but unchanged. But in any case, the the fact of the matter is that Canada has so much potential, and where is it going? What is it doing? How are we supposed to move forward? Where's the vision for this country? The second largest country in the world. We have abundant natural resources. We have a fairly well-educated population. We have decent infrastructure. It needs to be improved. We have decent infrastructure. How in God's name are we not a world power?
There's no reason why Canada couldn't be in the top 5 based on the natural resources, based on the people that they have. If they had a government that had a vision for building something, improving something, rather than just, we all know what the Liberals are all about. They've never been about that, any period of their history. So they are in there for their own good, for the better good of the Liberals. And they've never allowed the West to develop. And that's been a major problem for, 70 years. And people seem surprised when, the West might want to kind of run their own show a bit here. So.
How dare they? How dare they? I think a certain young lady kept saying that to everybody. The thing that kind of comes to mind here too is that with Canada, if Western separatists or sovereigntists, we're supposed to say sovereigntists on the show. I'm sorry.
Social sovereigns. Is that the nomenclature now?
Sovereignists or sovereigntists. That actually is a funny point to debate, because I'm pretty sure that the corrections on all the typing programs, like when you're using a word processing, I think they take my sovereignist and they want to turn it to sovereigntist. But the point is that whatever we're supposed to call ourselves here, nonetheless, I think that what happens with Western Canada is that there's that old line, right? Didn't like your old masters, how do you like your new one? This is the thing. If we're on this mission of like, we want better things for Western Canada, and we want better things for BC, right? Because we're based in BC here.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want better things for what's going to happen moving forward, the problem is that, hey, we already have some saviors. There's already people who are supposedly they're here to save us. That's what they're here to do, apparently. But I mean, if you look at the reaction to Jason Kenney in Alberta right now, I worked for this guy. I worked for him back in Ottawa. Well, a short time, and I was an intern. I shouldn't make it sound like I was running the place. But I got to deal with him a lot. I got to see him quite a bit. I got to see the front lines of what was happening out there. He's not a stupid man. He's not a lazy man. He's a hardworking man. And yet, as premier, he's just had one thing go wrong after another. And there's a lot of angry Albertans out there. His party might fracture in the first term of its government.
They already have. Half the caucus basically walked out on the idea of a third lockout. But, Kenney, I guess, as premier, Van der Zalm had the idea that, the buck stops here. Ultimately, Van der Zalm knew that whatever happened under his administration came back to him. So when things happen, like a church getting locked down with fences put in it, what is Kenney doing? Is Kenney putting his foot down saying, enough, we need to pull back on this, because the harder we push people on this, the more people are going to push back? So if he wants people to comply with these regulations, he would be better off to say, okay, let people have their freedoms. But I haven't seen that leadership from Kenney, and you would know him far better than I do.
That was a long time ago. As we kind of wrap up here, maybe something to dwell on for just a moment more is, again, that question of leadership. Actually, it's funny because we were talking about the pro-life thing at the beginning, and that doesn't mean that we were trying to avoid it throughout. I think we said some pretty strong things actually throughout it. But to even pivot back to that for just a moment, your kind of departure from some of the movement has been based on the leadership question, right? That the leadership isn't taking the steps it needs to take in order to achieve its end.
We have leaders. The problem is that they live in Florida now. That speaks volumes as to where the pro-life movement in Canada is headed. That the people that have led us for many years have put a lot of work and time and effort to build us up as a movement. They live in Florida. So what are we doing as Canadians to give these people a platform and a voice so that they can reach out to other Canadians. If I go out on any other media, Western Standard did give me an opportunity to write when we did Canada's Lost Daughters with Andrea Morozic, and God bless her heart, amazing lady. What are the media options doing? What are, do we have people coming on from the pro-life movement talking about, hey, here's the state of things. Here's how things are going. Here's what you can do to help us out. Here's people you can donate to. This is the next campaign we're doing. Did we get any of that with this? You mentioned the pro-life stopping Aaron O'Toole. Was there any coordination on the part of any of the media outlets here in Canada? There was none. If anything, the media was pretty much universally hostile to pro-lifers doing any kind of work together to, God forsake it, maybe actually elect a pro-lifer once in a while.
Just once. Again, it comes back to vision. And I think if there's anything that's clearly missing from this country, it's vision. I think we agree on this point. And even to the sovereignty question, this would probably be where I would put my stake. It's not that I'm unamenable to the idea of the West taking its own route or getting a better deal out of Ottawa by making some very clear threats. Totally fine with that. Quebec got away with it for years. God bless them. We should learn from that. But at the same time, where is it going to take us to? We have to think about where we want to go with that. And it doesn't mean it's all roses on the other side. There are very clear ways forward that go well, and there are some ways that go really bad. And I think that Ellis actually did a good job of articulating this earlier when he said, Venezuela sits on some of the richest oil reserves in the world. Venezuela is a joke, and it's a tragedy. It's sad what's happening to people there. And so, again, it's the same thing here for us. We have to have some clear vision as a country, clear vision as a culture, clear vision as a movement in order to achieve our ends. And if we don't, we are in serious trouble.
We are well on the way, Venezuela. And as Westerners particularly, I think it's important that if we want to retain control of our natural resources and not have what happened in Venezuela, where your refineries go down, where you can't have keep your lights on, that we have to take our own steps. That's how I see it. And a lot of people there are quite surprised because they say, well, that could never happen here. Well, Venezuela was the third richest country in the Western Hemisphere at one point.
And Quebec was the highest birth rate in the Western Hemisphere at one point. So link those two things together. I think that exactly encapsulates what's been going wrong in the post-war era in the West.
Pérez had his little outburst all those years ago. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring back Duplessis. That's where we'll end it. No, all right. It's enough hot takes from us today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I've been speaking with Sean Ollech, a local guy here in Prince George. We know each other pretty well. Very deep into the pro-life movement, and obviously a head for numbers. Or hopefully you can join us regularly at different times to kind of give us a read on numbers, especially if an election looms. We'll be talking about those things in the future.
Hot take, don't bet on Aaron.
Okay, there you go. And also thank you in advance for your analysis, and thank you for being here today, Sean.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, we're going to end her right there, and thank you so much for watching. Tune in again next Tuesday, same time, 9 to 11. We always broadcast live from 9 to 11 Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, 9 to 11 Pacific. That's 10 to 12 Mountain Standard Time.